Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Creating a Culture That Develops Human Capital. My name is Nina Cahill, and I am a Program Associate here at Learning Services at the Council of Michigan Foundation. Before we jump into the content of the webinar, I just have a few housekeeping items to share with you so that you can participate with questions and comments throughout the next hour. If you have any technical difficulties, please go ahead and contact ReadyTalk directly through the number listed on this slide. The question box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen will also be open throughout the session, so you're welcome to use this box to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and our presenters will keep an eye out to respond to your questions. Also, due to the number of people on the call, we just want to note that this session is being recorded, and we actually have not muted you so that you will be able to participate later. So we'll just ask you to go ahead and mute your own lines at this time to cut down on background noise. But please, also a note, please do not put yourself on hold, as then we will hear your hold music. So you can just go ahead and mute yourself until it's time to participate. Okay, so at this time, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. We have two presenters today. First, Dr. Lynn Perry-Wooten, who many of you are familiar with and know as the lead facilitator of the CMF Mentoring Program. Dr. Lynn Perry-Wooten is the Senior Associate Dean of Student and Academic Excellence and Clinical Professor of Strategy, Management, and Organizations at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. In her role as Associate Dean of Undergraduate Programs at the Ross School, she is responsible for developing and implementing transformational educational experiences for Ross undergraduate students inside and outside of the classroom through curricular initiatives, academic advising, student life activities, and developmental leadership. Dr. Wooten also serves as Scholar in Residence at the Council of Michigan Foundation. Today we also have joining us Crystal Sewell. Crystal Sewell joined the Kresge Foundation in 2008 as its first Human Resources Department Director. She is currently leading strategic efforts to build a vibrant organizational culture to support the Foundation's vision, which includes leadership development, organizational development, talent management, employee engagement, and supervisor and employee development. Prior to joining the Kresge Foundation, Crystal was the Director of Human Resources at the Toledo Museum of Art. Crystal received a BA in Public Administration from Eastern Michigan University, an MA in Administration from Central Michigan University, and certification in Organizational Development from Linkage, Inc. in partnership with DePaul University. She is certified as a Senior Professional in Human Resources by the Society of Human Resource Management and is certified as a Human Capital Strategist by the Human Capital Institute. In addition, Crystal is the co-chair of CMF's HR Affinity Group, along with Diana Langenberg of the Kellogg Foundation. So at this time, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Lynn Wooten to get us started.
Nina, thanks for those introductions. And Crystal and I are very honored today, and we're excited about this topic. And in a few minutes, I think you'll see why we're excited and energized. But before we formally get started, I would like to begin with an opening quote. Organizations that are deliberately developmental are committed to the development of all by creating growth as a necessary means for achieving results. And so what Crystal and I will be discussing today is this notion of what does it mean to be a developmental culture? How do organizations enact a commitment to individual growth? And finally, how do you channel that individual growth into collective impact and the results that your foundation or nonprofit organization wants to achieve? So our agenda for the day is, as you know, I always like you to understand the theory behind a concept that I'm presenting. So looking at the nuts and bolts. So we're going to spend some time conceptualizing what do we mean in the organizational theory literature when we talk about developmental culture. We're then honored to have a live case study of an excellent developmental culture. Crystal will be sharing her experience with the Kresge Foundation. And finally, we're going to close with some conversation and action. how do you take the concepts that we discussed and think about your own personal development, your team's development, and your organization's development? Many of the concepts that Crystal and I will present today can also be rooted and read in the book by Keegan and Lady. And the book is An Everyone Culture, Developing and Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization. And in addition to the book, the meeting invitation for the day provided with you a hyperlink. If you don't want to read the full book, there's a great Stanford Social Innovation Review article that summarizes the main concepts and really breaks them down into a language that is applicable for nonprofits and foundations. So take a pause there if you're eating your lunch or you're jotting down notes. I want to give an invitation to you to use the chat function. So in the text box, I want you to list any adjectives, activities that come to mind when you think of a culture that excels at developing its human capital. So it might be high-performance meetings, it might be training, it may be huddles. But take a minute to use the chat function. So thank you, Kayla, for saying investment in professional development. And I invite all of you just to chat down an adjective, a word, or activity that you think is a hallmark of a developmental culture. Laura mentioned the importance of communities of practice, and so she said funds for conferences and other professional development. That was Laura S. Laura O said that maybe the staff is the best practice we see. For me, I said performance coaching because I think coaching is important, and I know Crystal's going to touch on that. I love what Lynn said, and I'm going to talk about this. Lynn Williams said, the permission to fail forward, a psychologically safe culture where people can fail and you can learn from failures. Consistent feedback is what Kayla says, and James talks about the importance of transparency. And I think transparency as it relates to a learning agenda is very important. If you have other adjectives or activities, please feel free throughout the webinar to share them with us, anything that comes to your mind, and use the chat function as often as you would like. So organizations that are deliberate at developmental and human capital have three attributes. First, they really believe that if the organization is going to be successful, they have to align it with a people's notion to grow. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, it talks about each of us having a need for growth. And so if an organization is going to commit to people development, then they have to believe that growth is important. The second thing is, it's not only a belief, but the culture, the way they do business, the habits of the heart, the habits of practice, support the ongoing development of its employees. And then the third component is investing in it. And when I talk about investing, I'm talking about time, energy, and resources, especially financial resources, but also people resources. And I'm not only talking about one-offs, or I send someone to a conference, or I do a special workshop. The investment should be woven into the daily fabric of life. So how does the organization think about operations as it develops human capital? What daily routines reinforce and contribute to the development of human capital? And what type of conversations are going on? So think about those three principles for a moment. If you like to keep things simple, or if you have a math brain, another way to think of a developmental culture is a better me plus a better you equals a better us. So when you're thinking about the tools that you want to take back to your organization, think about, is the organization intentional about investing in a better me? Am I being intentional and taking the opportunities to invest in a better me? How are they investing in a better you? Those are the people you work with and the team you work on. And then when we have a better you plus a better me, is the organization a better us? In other words, is the organization better off because of these developments? Another important point, all organizations that are deliberately developmental believe in a growth mindset. So many of you may have seen the research by Carol DeWitt. Professor DeWitt talks about two mindsets. She talks about the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And I'm sure that we don't have any participants on this webinar that have a fixed mindset, but I will highlight a few points. When an individual has a fixed mindset, they think about failure and how failure may limit his or her abilities. I can either be good at something or not. You don't like to be challenged when you have a fixed mindset. You get frustrated easy. You stick to what you want to know. In contrast, a growth mindset sees failure as an opportunity to grow. Failure is just another point or stop on life's journey that you can learn from. People with a growth mindset try to learn from anything, so everything is a learning opportunity for them. They like challenges that help them grow. Feedback is important if it's constructive and generative. They are inspired by the success of others, not envious, but try to learn from other people who are successful and embrace it. And many people who have a growth mindset like to try new things. So another way to think about this notion of a growth mindset is we know from years of research that individuals who have a growth mindset are very successful. And sometimes when you're young, you're adolescents, or you're in your early 20s, you think success is easy. People are born successful. But if you think about the research we know from a growth mindset and you unpack it, it's not that people are born successful. It's that they work hard. They learn from disappointments and failures. They're persistent. They have very good habits, whether how they study or how they document things, their work habits, the people that they associate with they can learn. They're good at goal setting. And so success really is more than what we see on the surface. And in developmental organizations, they know this, and they invest in things that's helping their human capital have good habits, building a culture of work, making sure, as Lynn said, that you can fail forward are all important. So many of us may be familiar with the comic strip Dilbert, and we can say that Dilbert, in many situations, probably does not have a growth mindset. If you think about some organizations that are not deliberately developmental, a performance review may play out like this. And so Dilbert asked his boss, do you believe in human motivation is the product of a person's genes or the environment? And his boss in the green shirt says, duh. Yeah, both, duh. Anyway, I asked you here to discuss your terrible job performance. So right away, this is not a manager who's thinking about a developmental opportunity for performance coaching. And what does Dilbert say? We just did. You said it isn't my fault. And so when you think about this Dilbert comic strip, it really is this notion of maybe he's saying his environment is why his performance is so poor, or his gene pool. But today, what I'm challenging us to think about is, what are the type of work environments that create high performance? So we're going to look at 3 areas that organizations can align around to create high performance. And these 3 areas all contribute to being deliberately developmental. They're principles, the work communities, and the practices of an environment. So starting with principles, there are 4 principles I want you to think about. If an organization is intentional about the development of others, it starts with the premise that adults can grow. And not only do adults, not only can they grow, but they want to grow. We have this desire to grow, a strong need to grow. The second principle is development is essential. It's not an option. If an organization is not developing its human capital, it's failing. It's just as essential as achieving other goals, whether it be financial goals or programming goals or investment goals, technology goals. Development has to be essential. Thirdly, when we think about the principles, we all have weaknesses. We wouldn't be human if we did not have weaknesses. So how do we use those weaknesses as a strength? Or the flip side is, how do we make sure everybody brings their best self and that we pull strengths to alleviate weaknesses? Likewise, error is an opportunity for growth and learning. So we understand people make mistakes, and we use those mistakes to learn for them. The fourth principle of deliberately developmental organization is that just like you have financial performance or you have programming metrics, development is part of the performance metric. It's integrative in the bottom line. Every quarter, every fiscal year, I'm doing an inventory of what are my developmental activities, and I'm making sure their work to develop individual people, to make sure the team is high performing, and to ensure that the organization is achieving its goals. Moving from principles to community, and when you think about community, you can think about the culture. When an organization has a community that focuses on development, rank is not relevant. It doesn't have its usual privileges. You think about the American Express commercial that says membership has its privileges. What's important is your work ethic and your area of expertise. So a CEO of a foundation may be over the whole foundation and have the fiscal and governance responsibility for leading that foundation. But at the same time, the CEO needs to acknowledge that I'm not the expert like the CFO on investment or cost management. So that's an example where rank doesn't have its privilege. The expert, the person who's on the ground, the person who has the most knowledge is the person who has the privilege in developmental communities. HR is not pigeonholed to one person or one unit. Everyone thinks about HR. How do we recruit the best people? How do we develop the best people? How do we retain the best people? Next is, in addition to everyone being part of the human resource management department, everyone contributes to the culture. In organizations that are deliberately developmental, people get up every morning and say, okay, I'm going to work, I'm happy, I like my job, I have a growth mindset, but I'm also thinking about what can I do for the culture so that I grow, so that others grow, so that we're the best organization possible. The fourth attribute of deliberately developmental communities is this notion that everyone needs a crew. Think about organizational life. If everyone didn't need a crew, we all could be entrepreneurs doing our own ventures. But deliberate developmental culture thinks about what's the team I need to get my work done? What team is my community of practice? What team do I need to do for support every day when I come into work? Now let's discuss practices, and we know that actions are important. Deliberately developmental cultures don't rest on their laurels. They constantly think about, how do I create cycles of good to great? And many of you may have heard this quote from Jim Collins, or you've read the monograph Jim Collins has written about good to great for the social sector. Good is the enemy of great. And deliberately developmental cultures, good is not an enemy, because these organizations are always thinking about how they can be better even when they're good at something. So they build new ideals, they create new programs, they create new practices. They evaluate them. From those evaluations, they reframe and they reconstruct. And this leads into the second practice, always looking for gaps. Where are there rooms for improvement? How can we be better? how can we close those gaps? It could be performance gaps. It could be how we deliver something. It may be innovation gaps, but they're always looking for gaps. As I stated earlier, they dedicate time for development. It happens every day throughout the organization, in addition to formal workshops and training programs. And I really want you to spend some time thinking about the final practice. In deliberately developmental organizations, life and work are not separate spheres. They're integrated. People bring their best selves, but they also bring their personal and professional lives to the organization to make sure that we're thinking about development in both aspects of life. Before I turn it over to Crystal, I also want to bring in the parallels of deliberately developmental culture and a learning organization. So a learning organization is one that seeks to create its own future. In learning organizations, learning is an ongoing process. It's a creative process. And it's designed so that its members develop, adapt, and transform constantly. In learning organizations, you're closing the gaps. You're building and reconstruction and evaluating because you're constantly thinking about inside the organization and outside and how I can aspire to be better. In the words of Stingy, learning organizations continually expand its capacity. So how do I grow my capacity? How do I grow that mindset, my resources, my practices for the future to be excellent? And then if you're familiar with GEO, the Grant Educator Organization, there's also a great paper that talks about learning organizations from GEO. And GEO says a learning organization has a process for asking and answer questions that grant makers and nonprofits need to understand to improve their performance and achieve better results. And so essentially what this GEO monograph talks about is learning organizations are constantly asking questions: the what, the why, the how, the when, and the where. And through asking questions, they're acquiring knowledge and thinking about how the organization can develop, how the team can develop, and how the individual can develop. So Singy talks about when we think about organizational learning, and as I said, it parallels with being a developmental organization, they have a shared vision of what this learning looks like. And this shared vision is anchored in 4 components. The individual has to want to achieve personal mastery, and then that personal mastery transcends to team mastery. And so it's not only the individual, but how do we make collective impact? How do we create synergies? They have to have mental models about performance and what they think excellence is like, and then they have to engage in systems thinking from the inside the organization and outside the organization to see the organization as a system. And when you engage in systems thinking, you're thinking about the political environment, the economy, socio-culture trends, the impact of technology, and how it relates to the internal environment. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Crystal Sewell, who has some wonderful, abundant information that she's going to talk about the Kresge Foundation and how, as an organizational, they've been intentional about development of its human capital.
Thank you, Lynn. I am really honored, to provide and to share the information about Kresge's journey and how it aligns with everything Lynn has just shared with you in the previous slides. So first, I want to give you a little background about Kresge. Second, I'll walk you through sort of our own organizational culture change and how our change aligns with becoming a developmentally focused organization and where we are now. And then as a part of each slide, sort of talk about our lessons learned, areas for improvement as we continue to grow as an organization in this area. So Kresge has approximately 100 employees. About 10 years ago, we hired a new CEO, and we had about 25 employees at that time. Our new CEO, Rip Rapson, came on board and said he wanted a new vision for the foundation. And that vision was about expanding opportunities for low-income populations in cities. prior to his arrival, we actually did capital challenge grants, so you'll see a lot of signature grant making in Kresge with buildings named after us, some of which include things like the Kresge Eye Institute, the Kresge Library, and on different college campuses. We formed, as a part of the new vision, 6 program areas focused on arts and culture, education, environment, Detroit, health, and human services. About 9 years ago, we introduced social investments. We created our first human resources department in 2008 when I joined the foundation. We also created a communications department, and more recently, we introduced about a year and a half ago a learning, research, and evaluation department and team. We've updated our entire grants management system. We've actually gone through 2 conversions in the last 10 years, and with that, we've tripled our staff size, and 90% of our current staff were hired in the last 10 years. So we were on a big sort of shift or change in the impact we wanted to make externally, and that meant we need to prepare ourselves internally for the type of changes that we wanted to make. And at the time, we were very intentional about our strategies, how we wanted to engage our grantees, the type of grants we wanted to make, the impact in the community. We were hiring a lot of staff, but we were not initially as focused on our vision for our organizational culture. And so we really needed to think about how we wanted to work internally so we could actually live this vision externally. So that was the real focus of the work and the change we needed to make. A part of the journey, we actually developed a set of organizational values around how we wanted to work. We engaged the entire staff for about 9 months to provide input and to contribute to a set of values to guide how we wanted to work. We rolled out our values in 2013, and the values are not just posted on the wall. They are active and alive, and they drive how we do our business. And they're currently incorporated into our performance management system. We spend a half day annually engaging our entire staff around one or maybe all of our values during an all-staff retreat as well. The values are creativity, respect, stewardship, partnership, and opportunity. What I'd like to do is spend a little time talking about our value of opportunity and how it relates to this presentation today. Opportunity, unlike our vision, which is to focus on low-income populations, our opportunity value is about how we invest in our people. So this sort of moves us into how we are very deliberate about our people's development. We foster a workplace environment and culture in which people have every possible opportunity to express their talents and ambitions, be acknowledged and rewarded for their achievements, grow in their careers, and see their efforts reflected in a strengthened sense of common purpose. Because this work is focused intentionally, it created space for us to elevate the importance of staff's ability to grow. And growth, as we know, occurs in multiple ways. It's not limited to a traditional career path at Kresge. Oftentimes, we have people ask if, will they be promoted? Growth for us is about your continuous learning and development, not just limited to an identified role that's a next step in a person's career. We really look for a more individualized approach to growth and learning for each person. Executing and living this value required that we changed how we approached our work. We actually work with every employee to think about his or her own career trajectory and how they would like to grow and ensure that there are opportunities for growth and development. And one of the first steps we had to take was to really develop our staff to understand what this change meant within the organization. So in order to build a vibrant organizational culture, we moved directly into sort of a 4-part learning framework. And we use this learning framework to anchor all of our staff, starting with our leaders, to sort of build this learning culture. And one thing to note about this work, while it looks nice and clean, the approach to learning is not linear. Everyone has a unique set of needs. So as we're thinking about learning, we're thinking about the individual, we're thinking about the team, and what's the organizational infrastructure in order to enable these changes to occur. So we first started with anchoring our staff with a common set of principles in learning and development. The first step, which is the upper left quadrant of the visual, is to refine our organizational culture. It was to really set up those values to guide our work, be able to help us to prioritize and inform our decision making. Our staff needed to understand sort of the purpose of making this shift, which was for us to create a learning culture and engage staff in their own growth. We then had to anchor our leaders, and this was through a leadership development effort primarily focused on leaders. We wanted our leaders to have experience with effective feedback and coaching so that they can then transfer these skills over when they're working with their employees, so they could model coaching and feedback based on their own experience. So we quickly set a course for developing a set of leader competencies and leader development, 360 multi-rater feedback for leaders, along with executive coaching to provide leaders with a sense of how this could play out for them and their staff. And initially, oftentimes when you hear about a 360 feedback program, this is where multiple people will provide input for your own development or growth. Initially, it was met with some resistance. And it was resistance because maybe some years ago people didn't have either a good experience with executive coaching or 360 programs. What we were able to do is identify a program where people felt safe. And now I don't think I can offer enough coaches and 360 programs to keep up with the staff. If there's one thing to take away from the Kresge story, I'm not sure. We offer so much to staff, I'm not even sure if they could absorb it all. So we'll talk about that as one of the lessons learned, and one of the things that Kresge is really trying to work through is that work-life balance. We've extended the coaching to other staff members for other kinds of development opportunities. So we're in the process of designing sort of a peer coaching program so that it occurs on a day-to-day basis and daily conversations so we could all learn to coach each other. We did a specific carve-out for our program department. We spent time, because our program department is really on the ground working with our grantees. How does this work play out directly with the grantees? So we developed a special carve-out for them. And then we offered all staff development opportunities. It created space for staff to develop and enhance their skills in giving and receiving feedback. We introduced several cohort groups for learning opportunities. For example, we introduced what we call the Administrative Leadership Institute, and this is where our administrative staff came together and went through a series of workshops around team development and training just for that cohort of staff. We've also introduced other team building sessions for employees and different cohorts of employees. So our program staff roundtable and other leader development roundtables. We also offer external leadership development opportunities where we actually spent time researching what might the external leadership development opportunities look like and how do we make those available to staff. So we've really invested in internal learning and some of the external learning. Again, some of the lessons that we've learned from this work is learning is definitely not a linear process. While employees are hungry and seeking additional learning opportunities, they have also expressed they're concerned about their capacity to either experience or absorb all of the learning. So we need to work with employees to design their learning experience in a way that they could absorb it all. And then our next step is to really think about how we might design some more on-demand experiences, because the focus now is about the individualization. This initial set of learning was designed to anchor all staff in a new mindset around learning and development. So with that, we move to a more individualized approach to learning. Once we anchored staff, we recognize that employees all have a unique set of aspirations and desire to learn and to grow. So we thought about applying Dan Pink's model of motivation, which is autonomy, the desire to be self-directed, mastery, the urge to get better results, and purpose, the desire to do something that is meaningful and important. And so we designed an individual development planning guide for staff, and the tool was designed so that to assist employees and to self-direct their own engagement, develop the set of skills to align with their aspirations and connect to a deeper meaning of the work. And the individual development plan is owned by the employee with input and coaching from the manager. So the actual employee needs to ignite their individual development plan. This is really anchored with assisting the employees in uncovering their talents. We introduced Gallup's Strengths Finders so that those talents within the Strengths Finders program could be applied in their work and help employees understand deeper how to apply their strengths. So as a part of the Strengths Finders program, employees received sort of their top 5 strengths. You receive actions, ideas for different actions based on your strengths. And then we use this with the managers to help them think about the employee strengths, their talents, how you might invest those talents in your experiences, develop your skills and your knowledge to continue to build on those strengths. So the individual development guide used a strengths-based action plan for setting goals and for building and applying the employee's strengths. So one of the things we learned about this individualized approach is, in some ways, we sort of needed to design a check-in system, because what we found is not all employees had developed their individualized plan or were engaged. But because it's highly individualized, we do think sort of thinking about it from that perspective is the right perspective to think about it, so employees could think about their own growth, because we know it's important for staff to be individualized. One of the things we highlighted as a part of the individual development plans is to use the 70-20-10 learning model. This model was adapted from the Center for Creative Leadership probably a little over 30 years ago, but still relevant, particularly to us today, and that is where 10% of the learning comes from formal learning, like training courses or even webinars like today. And these are primarily like classroom-type trainings, or books or articles, or access to professional memberships. 20% of learning comes from informal networks. So one-on-one meetings, things like the mentorship program that you're participating in today, 360-degree feedback, strengths-based coaching, action review meetings. And then 70% comes from on-the-job experiences. So increasing the scope of responsibility, taking on new projects, taking a lead role on a cross-functional team, tackling a new or unsolved problem within your organization. So how do you embed the learning in your work? So how do you think about learning in your work? So this shift then helps to minimize the challenge of kind of work-life balance, because the learning is occurring in your daily work. One of the challenges we still have yet to manage with this is tracking the metrics, right? How has this shift in our organizational culture impacted our ability to achieve our organizational results. We can definitely see a significant change, but there are some anecdotal changes that we can document, and what are the qualitative and quantitative changes that we need to document. So we've introduced all of these components within the organization, and now we recently hired a dedicated person, a deputy for talent and organizational development, who focuses primarily on talent development and staff engagement. And with that, now what we've done is captured sort of the historical aspects of our work into sort of this one model of knowing yourself, and this is where we're utilizing things like our strengths finders and for the employee to understand themselves, engaging with the team, how you might participate in team building workshops, sharing feedback with your team, and taking action to grow. Employees just can't write down your goals, but you really need to enact your growth through some kind of action, which is the 70-20-10 model. How do you really activate the growth? How do you apply your learning, primarily with some of the on-the-job experiences? As a part of the individual development planning guide, we actually provide employees a list of examples and how they could apply their learning, so when they're meeting with their manager, they can really think through the application of their learning. And then the fourth component is to have meaningful conversations. These are conversations with your manager or other foundation managers who may be able to assist you in your growth. Again, examples of that would include informal mentoring, maybe even a formal mentoring program like the CMF program, participation in different projects that are happening within the foundation, or leading different projects, serving on boards. So there's a way to have different meaningful conversations. I thought I would share with the years of progress with Kresge. There's a short list, I would call, of opportunities that align directly with DDO's model for learning that we really apply, and it's a part of how we operate now. It's not an extra or some standoff piece of the work. It is integrated into our daily experiences at Kresge. So there is an all-staff retreat. So when we think about the organization-wide, what are some of the things that we do to enable the learning to happen? One is to establish it as one of our values to guide how we work. We truly invest in our staff. And so from an organizational standpoint, we dedicate a full 2 days for an all-staff retreat. It's highly interactive, and that retreat really ties back into our work. It focuses on our vision and our values. In addition, we connect all staff with our grantees through a grantee volunteering experience. We host lunch and learn within the organization, so probably every team within the foundation has hosted some form of a lunch and learn. These are open to all staff, so everybody within the foundation can learn something about a different area within the foundation. We host team retreats. So when we think about teaming, we host team retreats. Teams participate in sort of personality profiles so we can learn about differences. We also formulate cross-functional teams. Again, I've mentioned the Admin Leadership Institute, where our admin staff are engaged in a leadership experience as well, and now it's ongoing. And then individually, stretch assignment. So we have employees taking on leadership opportunities. We pull together a grantee perception task force. So based on the feedback from the grantee perception report, we had some co-leads, but then several 8 to 10 subgroup leaders, and this is a great opportunity to apply skills with some different stretch assignments. Again, we've talked about some of the external leadership development programs. So professional development I did not list on here, but different conferences related to your work or outside of your work. We even sponsor different conferences where we may send a cohort of staff to attend, and then other internal and external leadership opportunities. One of the things that we know is that learning is individualized. Organizations must focus on a bit of the individual because you want a customized experience, and this is where the coaching really works well, to coaching not just the manager but the employee to really understand this as a part of the culture and really to cultivate continuous learning and growth. And the risk-taking that's necessary, you learn from a lot of times what we call your failures. This is where some of the best learning takes place, so creating a space for that to happen. And then our biggest challenge is the staff capacity to absorb all of the opportunities that we make available. We recently participated and completed a study around what's called work-life conflict. We partner with a firm called Ideas for Two, where they're really looking at this across the country and within philanthropy, and we genuinely hope that from this they'll be able to provide us with some different strategies to help us to still fulfill sort of the growth aspirations, but also to help us to manage the issues around work-life conflict. So I thank you for the opportunity to share highlight, I would say, some of Kresge's journey with learning within our organization. And so I'll turn it back over to Lynn to continue the slides.
I told you that Crystal had an excellent presentation prepared for us, and that's all I can say is, Crystal, will you hire me to come work at the Kresge Foundation? Because I want to participate in all you're doing there. I'm so excited. So offline, I'll contact you about that.
Absolutely.
I want to close with this notion of, we've had a conversation about, as Crystal was saying, the DDO, what does it mean to be a deliberately developmental organization? How do we go to action now? What are some actions? I want us to commit to actions before this webinar ends in 12 minutes that we can take. So when we think about actions, I'm going to use this quote from Gandhi: actions express our priorities. You've heard a lot the last 48, 49 minutes. So what actions do you want to prioritize? So I want to go through a couple things. We're going to do some ranking polls and talk about some examples of how you can take these actions, these DDO actions, back to your own organization. So if you recall, the first thing we discuss is organizations that are deliberate at developing human capital prioritize their principles. They identify and live by developmental principles. They invest in the growth of human capital. These organizations create a safe space to learn from mistakes and work on weaknesses. And they have performance metrics, just like finances or organizational culture. They track how they're developing and learning as an organization. So we have a poll here. I'd like you, from 1 to 4, to use this poll and rank which of these you think are more important. So if you think that creating a safe space is the most important, you will rank that as 1, and if secondly, performance metrics would be 2. So take a minute, complete this poll, and I will report out the rankings. And you're going to rank them on a scale of 1 to 4, with 1 being the most important. So for our first poll, the highest ranked one where we thought was the most important, and which makes sense, is identifying and living by developmental principles. Organizations have to know what they want to do. Creating safe spaces was also up there, so they're almost neck and neck. Then the third one was this notion of investing in growth. And then finally, fourth rank was implementing the performance metrics. One example of living by principles, and many of you are familiar with the work of the Forge Foundation, is their grid here. And I love this quote from Darren Walker, the Forge Foundation CEO. The Forge Foundation believes in embracing risk and reflecting honestly on our accomplishments as well as our disappointments. That's why we're committed to building and sustaining a culture of learning. And some of you talked about things that are important in a culture of learning, such as this transparency, this constant feedback and consistent, this notion of using your strengths. And if you think about Kresge and how they're building this learning culture and their principles, it entails doing, collaborating, sharing, and improving. So doing is the act of doing philanthropic work. Collaborating is probably internal teams and external partnerships. Ford Foundation is very good about not only creating knowledge, but sharing it with all stakeholders. And then finally, remember, we don't want good to be the enemy of great. The Ford Foundation's learning principle is about how do we improve our performance. So we have another poll here. If you recall, community was a big part of what we talked about, and there were 4 priorities or principles for communities for deliberately developmental organizations. Rank does not have its usual privileges. Everyone is human resource management. Everyone builds and contributes to the culture, and everyone needs a career. So I'd like you to rank which one do you think is more important, similar to the previous poll, with 1 being the most important and 4 being the least important. So for example, for me, everyone needs a crew is very important, and my number 2 would be rank does not have privileges. So think about that. And looking forward to seeing your polling responses. So far we have 11 responses, and interestingly, the one that had the highest one is everyone builds and contributes to the culture. So that was the first place one, and then the second place one was rank does not have its usual privileges. And we talked a lot about the importance of culture defines who we are, what we want to be, and our guiding principles. And so that's definitely important for DGO companies. Organizations, and we know that rank shouldn't have privileges. It should be, can you do the work? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the expertise? Are you a good team player? Are you on the ground with intimate familiarity with the situation? The final component that we talked about is this notion of community. One way to think of community is going from the me to the we when we talk about community. And if you think about what we just talked about, prioritizing community, these are some principles to take away with you and practice it. Just because you're higher ranked doesn't mean you get a free pass. Titles should be unimportant. It's how you do the work, leading with grace and integrity. If you're going to be HR, and focus on HR, the development of people is everyone's business. It's not a separate activity. As you can see from the Kresge Foundation, development is not a separate activity. It's integrated into everything the Kresge Foundation does. Everyone should have a crew, and why do you need a crew? Because the crew supports you. Remember, it's the me plus the you makes a better us. The crew is also there to call out your blind spots, and your crew should be vested in your development. And then when you think about the culture, everyone's expected to both embody and strengthen the culture. And how do you do this? You do this through your daily practices, your routines, and the organizational structure and performance metrics should echo the culture values. Okay. Let's move on to prioritizing practices, and I'm conducting another quick poll here. So there are 4 practices we talked about: construct, evaluate, reframe, and reconstruct. That's this notion of building continuous cycles of good to great. You have to mind the gaps and make sure that you're managing them, dedicating time for development, and the importance of integrating work and life by making time for the interior life. So quickly, please rank which ones you think are important. For me, for example, number 1 is that I think deliberately developmental cultures spend a lot of time integrating work in the personal life. So that would be my number 1. total, we have 11 responses, and the top one is really dedicating time for development. I know we're all so busy at work, so I can understand that time is very important. And then the second one is integrating work and life by making time for the interior life. Thank you for sharing your responses on the polls. I do want to share a couple examples of prioritizing practice. The Skillman Foundation is an example there, and when you think about their practices of being deliberately developmental organization, they continuously look at policies and practices and results and how they're making change. They speak a lot about team alignment, and teams think about what will it take to be a good job. Very thoughtful about data-driven and having feedback loops. Communication on the inside the organization and the outside the organization is important. Taking time to reflect, interpret, and make adjustments along the way are one of the ingredients of them being a learning organization. And then the final one says, understand when it's headed in the right direction and being able to accelerate, and knowing when you're heading in the wrong direction and putting the brakes on it and talking about it openly and honestly. So if you want to learn more about the Skillman's practices, there's a great white paper on Skillman being a learning organization. Some final tips also is many of you, as you said, your number one practice was developing time for development. Crystal gave us a whole host, and here are just a checklist you might want to take back to your organization. Lunch and learns, book clubs, coaching, feedback sessions. How often do you do a field trip at another organization? Making sure that your meetings are generative, webinars such as these, embodying a question culture. With regards to living the integrative life and being intentional about it, it's making sure throughout your organizational practices that you make regular room and time to bring the personal in. Welcoming things such as, what did you join this weekend? How are things going with you? What are your interests? What are your hobbies outside of work? Thinking about this balance in life and health and work and career. The final thing I want to talk about, and then we may be out of time so we can take questions offline, Crystal and I want to talk about this notion of minding the gap. And I want to close with this. This comes from the book by Keegan and Leahy. And this minding the gaps is, if we're really going to focus on being a deliberate development organization, we have to say, how do we mind the gaps? And to mind the gaps is what we do and what we say. There should not be a gap. What we feel and what we say, there should not be a gap. What we say at the water cooler and what we say in meetings, there should not be a gap. How we assess someone's performance and how we later provide feedback, there should not be a gap. What we know about the organizational principles and how we apply them, there should not be a gap. And what we know to be the organization's deepest purpose and how we actually operate at every level, there should not be a gap. So I want to thank you for your participation, and then I think I'll turn it back over to Nina.
Okay, great. So I'd like to just thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar, and also to extend our thanks to Crystal and Lynn for taking the time to join us and give these really excellent presentations of this content. So thank you so much, Crystal and Lynn. And for all the attendees, later today you will be emailed a survey link from CMS for an evaluation for today's program. So we'll really just encourage you to please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation, as your feedback is very important to us. Also, please disregard the ReadyTalk default evaluation that will populate when you complete the webinar. We'll be sending out the correct one shortly. And so we want to note a couple of upcoming programs that are happening specific to the mentoring program. Before we talk about that, I also want to note that we have a Talent and Human Resources Affinity Group meeting coming up on April 7th at the Kresge Foundation. So this is the affinity group that Crystal is actually the co-chair of. This will be a great opportunity just to meet with talent and human resources peers for an interactive group discussion and follow up on some of the content here with more practical ideas and strategies to take back to your organization. So we'll be sending out information about that program along with the survey link to reference. Additionally, for the mentoring program participants that we have on the call, we'd like to note that on April 6th, we have our executive expertise webinar. And on May 19th, we are going to have our in-person mentoring program graduation. We're also excited to announce that we have confirmed a venue for the graduation. It will be taking place at the Kellogg Center at Michigan State University in Lansing. So we're really excited to have this venue confirmed in a central location that'll be convenient for everyone, and we'll be sending more information out about that shortly as well. Just again, thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon.